Trump's claim that the new Expropriation Act constitutes a massive human rights violation against white landowners has drawn sharp criticism from the South African government, which argues that the law is a constitutional mechanism aimed at redressing historical injustices. At the heart of this controversy is a long-standing issue in South Africa, the redistribution of land to address racial disparities entrenched by apartheid-era policies. While proponents of the law see it as a necessary step towards economic justice, opponents, including some South African opposition parties, warn that it could undermine property rights and deter foreign investment. Well, I'm being joined now by Sanusha Naido, policy analyst. Thank you so much for being here this morning on News Now. Let's get straight into it. South Africa's land expropriation law is currently under scrutiny. Before we delve into the controversy, can you explain to us what necessitated this law and what it aims to actually achieve?
Good morning, and good morning to your viewers. The law essentially is the kind of reconstitution of the 1975 Act, which essentially gives an unfair advantage to certain people in the context of access to land. It also goes back to the 1913 Land Act, which essentially took away almost 85% of the land from native South Africans and gave it to white South Africans in terms of this 85-13% construct. So in other words, what the Expropriation Act or bill was about was essentially to rectify imbalances of the past, where like in your country, like in anywhere in the world, I think there's no such thing as exceptionalism to what South Africa is doing, is that land becomes a critical identity, a critical ideology, a critical access, where people have, in terms of the law, been legislatively dispossessed, and now we're trying to reconstitute that, redress that act. And so when you talk about the Expropriation Act and that act that was signed into law by the president, you've got to look at context, because those opponents that are saying that it's going to take away land from or dispossess property owners, etc., don't really understand that it doesn't do that. It's still based on a willing buyer, willing seller model, which is what the African National Congress has always projected and put forward. If you look at the act itself, it's based on the Constitution. And the Constitution is very clear about the question of redress and how do you deal with that. So I think there's a lot of interesting noise that is being made, but people who are uninformed, ignorant, like President Trump, who's just kind of shooting from the hip, because it's not about how it's going to be dispossessed. It's not about basically challenging ownership right now and saying, oh, we're going to go in and start dispossessing, taking away farms. It's about how you define the public interest. And remember, this bill was in the parliament, in the 5th and 6th parliament, under discussion when members of the GNU, those that are sitting in the GNU, also opposed this bill then. But it got ratified in a very kind of broad way.
All right. I want us to examine this further, in as much as we're looking at the expropriation laws. Now, some persons have argued, especially critics, that new act allows for expropriation without compensation, and therefore it lacks clear parameters. Is that accurate?
Well, it says expropriation at the base of nil, but that's still not necessarily, the clarification of that could be tested in a court of law. It could be under a litigation. And that's what is important to understand, is that everybody is kind of making assumptions and making projections about this, where we haven't really tested this law. We haven't really seen what this law is going to do in terms of this expropriation without compensation. In fact, if you look at the reports of the 5th and 6th Parliament in terms of this act, and when it came to be approved, it was approved by the ANC members in the committee in the 6th Parliament. It was not approved by the EFF nor the DA. Both those parties objected to the bill, in terms of one in the context of what expropriation means, and the other in the context of the idea that expropriation without compensation will actually continue to further dispossess people who who illegitimately had their land taken away from them. Now, the question here is the public interest clause in the bill. Now, what the public interest clause is whether or not a land will be expropriated in the public interest if it is for indeed things like building infrastructure that is in the national interest. Here we'll have to see whether it gets tested around this compensation issue, because at the moment nobody actually knows what the compensation will look like unless we test it or unless it goes under litigation and there is a test case law around jurisprudence that tells us that this law may need to be reversed or not reversed but redefined in the context of compensation. So right now we don't know, and everybody's just looking at it and talking about it rhetorically.
All right, let's look at President Ramaphosa and Elon Musk in the picture. I mean, a close associate of the United States President Donald Trump. Now, they have both spoken about alleged misinformation surrounding this issue. What outcome can we anticipate from this diplomatic row?
Well, I think the challenge here is that the assumption is being made that this law is going to basically inherently threaten certain race groups in South Africa. And of course, President Trump was very clear about, it's going to be bad, it's going to be very bad for white people in the country and so forth. What is important to bear in mind is that this is a national sovereign state. We are able to and we can make laws that don't necessarily affect the US. How does an expropriation law in South Africa affect the national interests of the United States? It's very unclear, it's very clumsy, and it seems to be just complete ignorance on the part of the Trump presidency.
Do you think, sorry to butt in, do you think that Elon Musk is possibly the one responsible for all of this?
I don't know. I can't answer that question with any certainty. That's a speculation which you'll need to ask Mr. Elon Musk if he is responsible for. And that is what we're trying to get away from, because this whole thing around the interpretation of the act, the law, etc., seems to be caught in a lost in translation. So I can't tell you that because I don't have the evidence to tell you that. You'll have to ask Mr. Elon Musk what does he think, is he responsible? But this misinformation and disinformation campaign about the law, I think needs to be looked at in the context of how people are looking at it on social media spaces. And I think what is important for us to bear in mind is that you mentioned earlier the question of certain opposition members or parties being objecting to it. Well, what has happened subsequently is that the response to Mr. Trump and to those detractors that have come out against the law, whether in the US or elsewhere, is that the government of national unity has come out in a collective way and said, no, the interpretation. Even Mr. Steenhuisen, the leader of the Democratic Alliance, who is the Minister of Agriculture in the GNU, has come out and also said, let me clarify a few things. So I think this has for the first time shown a level of collectiveness where the GNU has said, we're not going to allow this to derail us.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot to bite on this, maybe more than we can chew, but I'm sure as time goes by, a lot will be unfolded. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks for speaking with us this morning on News Now.